Welcome to the ACEVEDO video store. Today, I have something very exciting to announce. I have watched every single movie on the Game of Thrones Bruceploitation Collection Vol.1 Blu-ray set. Yes, so I bought this I think about 2 or so months after it initially came out, or a month or so afterwards. And surprisingly enough, from the people that personally know me or are aware of me, no, I did not watch every single movie at one go and all that, even though I was quite excited for this box set. It took some time to go through every single movie and all that, and also I have made reviews on my YouTube channel about some of the films when their anniversaries came by. But now I've seen every movie on this set, so I thought it would be appropriate enough to rank them all. Most of the movies here are highlights of the Bruceploitation genre. So you have the biography films, the most famous ones like Clones of Bruce Li, the Dragon Lee movies, also some obscure ones like Big Boss Part 2 and Black Dragon vs. Yellow Tiger, all spread out, totaling about 14 movies. Now, before I rank the movies, I just want to get out of the way. I'm not going to rank Enter the Clones of Bruce, the documentary about the entire subgenre, because the majority of the films on the set are, the actual Bruceploitation movies themselves. So I really want to focus on that. But Enter the Clones of Bruce is a really great documentary that interviews the people who are behind the films and the Bruce Lee impersonators, and puts in perspective on what they service in martial arts film history and all that. Because, like it or not, there were a bunch of them in the 70s up until the 80s, more than 100 of them, and this led filmmakers in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the Philippines just hone in their craft with the limited resources they had with small budgets for the most part. So a great documentary, and I think you should probably watch that first if you're going to get this Blu-ray set, just to get the context will be the films you'll see when you're digging into the box set. But in any case, without procrastinating, let's begin. One of my least favorite movies of the set, which is also what I consider as a very so bad it's good movie, which for context, I don't consider most of these movies so bad it's good. I find them mostly entertaining, but not outrageously terrible where I find them completely funny and all that. This one, it was that, and that's the Super Dragon Bruce Lee story, aka The Dragon Dies Hard, which is confusing because I think there's another Bruceploitation movie also called The Dragon Dies Hard, both starring Ho Jung-tao under his pseudonym Bruce Li. But Super Dragon takes a historical value of being one of the earliest Bruceploitation film, one of the first biography film made a few months or barely a year after Bruce Lee's death, and having Ho Jung-tao expressively playing and mimicking Bruce Lee, and it's not very good. The story is very melodramatic. It's actually very overbearing on how melodramatic it is, focusing on the tabloid side of Bruce Lee's life, talking about Betty Ting Pei, of course, which I think they changed her name to Betty Tang, because instead of Ting, it's Tang. Same thing with Bruce Lee. In the movie, he's known under his Chinese name, Li Xiaoyong. The actual name was Li Shuyong. But when you get into these biography films, presenting facts accurately on Bruce Lee's life is kind of a low priority. Not only that, they're also presenting a message of Chinese nationalism. I know it's a little weird because, Bruce Lee is very much of an international man, I would say. He was very progressive and all that, even though he faced discrimination in the US, which shows in Super Dragon where he's getting bullied around and all that. With these biography films, they portray him as very patriotic about Hong Kong. That's more of a Dragon Lives discussion, but Super Dragon is very focused on 70s era Bruce Lee, particularly when he arrives in Hong Kong to make the big boss and then up until Bruce Lee's death. I think they actually skip over Enter the Dragon, now thinking about it, because it's very vague on details. I'm assuming for legal reasons. Also, the filmmakers probably think that if you're going to watch this movie, you already have a basic idea who Bruce Lee is. It's very of a Cliff Notes version of Bruce Lee's life. It speeds through the 1960s. So we already have Bruce Lee in the US teaching martial arts. The movie's not filmed in the US, it's actually filmed in Taiwan. So they try to barely disguise the Taiwanese locations as the US. So you see some English signs, a bag written in English, and Caucasian actors, of course, which I think they were actually more European actors. From the behind-the-scenes aspects I heard from The Dragon Lives, most of the foreigners they would get for the movies were actually from Europe compared to the US. So we're getting into different levels of tomfoolery here of what they bring along for these movies. There's actually quite surprisingly few fight scenes, so it's mostly drama / martial arts movie, but mostly focusing on its drama, especially the last 30 minutes of movie, where I was thinking, man, when's this going to finish? Man, man, I don't really care about Betty Ting Pei. Along with all this, you also have a very bad English dub, and I mean a really bad English dub. Not like, the lines are out of sync and all that, but the performances are incredibly stilted.
Darling, I really don't care if you're famous. I just want us to have a happy life after we're married.
And they're also very poorly written. So I was laughing along at whatever random odd pieces of dialogue that the characters were saying to each other. Partly listening to the audio commentary for this film, which actually has a partial audio commentary, not a full audio commentary. But it talks about how there's different versions of the movie. Particularly there's a version of the movie where it has a different opening and edits in footage of Jimmy Wang Yu, possibly from Blood of the Dragon from I read online. So that's why there's some US one sheets that say Super Dragon special guest star Jimmy Wang Yu. There's different dubs of the movie. I'm presuming foreign dubs, like Italian or Germany, where they actually change the character's name from Shaolin to Bruce. So they're not saying Shaolin, look at this. They're actually saying Bruce, look at this. But this is one of the few Bruceploitation films that faced against legal litigation. This one being notable because it was sued by the Bruce Li estate. And I think it's because of the portrayals of the family members, especially Linda Lee and also their kids, which if the kids don't appear often and all that, it's very focused on Bruce Lee's affair with Betty Ting Pei. Which adds on to how hilarious it is because at the end of the movie, Shaolin is like, I talked to Lena about divorce. Yes, Linda Lee is named Lena, which I thought it was the dubbers mispronouncing her name. So instead of saying Linda, they go Linda. I was checking the subtitles, so you actually do change the name to Lena, Lena. The only good thing about the movie is that with the few fight scenes it has actually are pretty well choreographed for the most part. A little rough on a few edges here and all that because this is probably before Ho Jung Tao really crafted his work and all that in terms of these fight sequences. But the cinematography is actually really great and sometimes creative in a few scenes and all that. But man, this is a really terrible movie. But after this film, we're going to get two not terrible movies but decent films, and then we're going to get to really fun movies. The next film was very disappointing to me. I had very long expectations for it, but it wasn't that terrible. The Big Boss Part 2, the sequel to The Big Boss that made Bruce Lee into an international star. Or at least that's what the trailer said. So this one, you actually have to get the bonus disc from the website to actually watch the movie. It unfortunately presents the movie not in the best film elements, but this one has the value of having Bruce Lee in his first appearance, or be more specific, Bruce Lee's character from The Big Boss. This sequel takes place apparently 20 years after the events of the first movie. So apparently takes place in the 1990s. So now Loli is on a revenge mission for Bruce Lee to fight against the Ice Factory manager from the first movie, who has now taken over the Ice Factory. There's also a subplot of a local gang wanting treasure from the Ice Factory manager, and they're using Lo Li to get closer to it. Big Spark Part 2 sits close of being a terrible movie, but it saves itself from having pretty decent fight scenes and all that, and having that somewhat of the main focus. The story is a little bit absurd in a few scenes. The cinematography is pretty decent for the most part, but when I saw the movie, I kind of got the impression that I think the movie would have been just completely forgotten, or at least just obscure trivial oddball note to pick at. It's oh, this is one of Loli's obscure films, but the only reason that we really remember it is because of the Bruce Lee connection, the Bruceploitation connection, and was sought after. And then when people actually got to see the movie, they're like, it was fine. So moving on to the next film, it's The Black Dragon versus the Yellow Tiger. Possibly one of the first, not the earliest films, one of the first Bruceploitation films. Officially on IMDb or Letterboxd and all that, it lists the movie as 1974. But according to Clint Robinson, one of the main fighters of the film that appears more towards the end, the Black Dragon of the title, he talks about how the movie actually premiered in late 1973 in the US because they had a screening in San Francisco where he was based at. He couldn't show up there because his wife actually went into labor, so he had to be there for the birth of his son. But he wasn't specific on the date, but I think they mentioned that it came out after Enter the Dragon. So not only it was a Bruceploitation film made in 1973, right when Bruce Lee was alive, it was released right after Bruce Lee died, which I think it was unintentional from the filmmaker's point of view and all that, because this was apparently shot the spring of 1973. So even before Bruce Lee's death, there was already imitators in the making. You don't get a Bruce Lee impersonator, but instead you get Bruce Lee's cousin and it's a sequel to The Way of the Dragon, apparently the only sequel to The Way of the Dragon, which is pretty weird because I think there's a few Bruceploitation movies that take inspiration from Way of the Dragon, like whether it's taking place in Rome or having like Caucasian fighters and all that towards the end of the movie. But where we left off from The Way of the Dragon, where John Ben, the leading gangster of Rome, gets arrested by the police thanks to Bruce Li. In the beginning of The Black Dragon vs. Yellow Tiger, we're introduced to this organization of mobsters, and they're pretty upset that John Ben got arrested. So they're trying to send in people to try and track down Bruce Li. Instead, they confuse his cousin as Bruce Li and all that, and it all leads to a fight at the end of the movie with the Black Dragon, aka Clint Robinson. And I find the movie to be pretty decent and all that. Pretty well choreographed fight scenes, a story maybe a little bit basic and slightly slow in the middle and all that in terms of the pacing. This is also only available on the bonus disc. Fortunately for both films, they also have a hard time being preserved. You're going to hear that more throughout this video. Producers of these films thought they had like a limited lifespan in terms of profitability, so they thought there was no point of trying to pay money to properly preserve these movies. So after their initial runs in theaters, the original negatives would be stored away, not in the greatest conditions for the most part, or even being thrown away. It gets worse towards the 80s when, after the video market came around, they transferred them on videotapes. They're like, okay, that's it, no new formats, throw those silly film prints away, which makes it harder because now we have HD and 4K, and it could show all these movies in the best quality possible, but we don't have the best film elements to do that, especially for The Black Dragon vs. Yellow Tiger, which was apparently playing for several years in 42nd Street, more as the tail ends of like double or triple features, but because the film was released in the US by Aquarius Releasing, who will be known for distributing these martial arts movies, especially the Bruceploitation movies. Fortunately, like pre-print film elements don't exist, so they had to Frankenstein together, I think 2 or 3 35mm theatrical prints, but you're still missing footage that's not featured in this HD master. This also features the English dub, but I also noticed that Mike Worth posted that he apparently got a VCD of the original Mandarin version, but according to Mike Worth in another interview, they apparently had a hard time licensing alternate audio tracks, so most of the movies on the set are presented in their English dubs. Besides that, I do like Black Dragon vs. Yellow Tiger, especially its very funky soundtrack, which is mostly stolen music from blaxploitation films. So yeah, Black Dragon vs. Yellow Tiger, a pretty decent martial arts film. The next film also has a piece of historical value to it. I guess every film on this set has a piece of historical value to it. Apparently being one of the first action movies to be filmed in Cameroon, Africa. That being Alphonse Beni's Cameroon Connection. Now, I did make a review of this movie a few months back and all that for its like 41st anniversary, because I realized there isn't like a whole lot of online discussion about this film, because it is very much one of the more obscure films on the set, and I also feel like it's one of the least Bruceploitation-esque movies on the set, which is ironic to say because this is probably one of the best looking movies on the set because it's a 4K master from an original camera negative. It feels very much like a bonus film that I felt like, Black Dragon vs. Yellow Tiger could have taken its place and all of that, or maybe The Big Boss 2 could have taken its place. But I did somewhat enjoy and all that. I like the story, but I find the dialogue and the French dubbing performances to not be that great. Because when you're reading the subtitles, it feels like a sentence that should be spoken with more of a dramatic tone. And the fight scenes, compared to all the films on the set, is probably like the worst out of the bunch and all that. The local actors, they weren't equipped for martial arts fight choreography. When Bruce Li appears on screen, the fight scenes are really great. Then when our friends Beni appears in screen, the fight scenes suddenly get terrible. I showed a clip to this to Damien and Taj when they came by to watch the Bod Squad, which I will link into that podcast on the description here just to get more people to watch it. But after we watched that movie, we were talking about Bruceploitation for a bit afterwards, and I showed them a clip of Cameroon Connection, and we were all just laughing how Beni fights in this like weird way. In my review, I nicknamed it Pigeon Foo, but when we were seeing that clip, we coined the term Beni Foo. And Damien also pointing out that at some point one of the actors ripped their pants in half. I did also like the cinematography as well and the soundtrack, although with the cinematography it feels very much improvised in a few scenes, especially some of the action scenes where the guy is like panning up and down, zooming in, zooming out. The movie is apparently part of a series of Inspector Baiko films, which Alphonse Beni was pretty famous in Africa playing, Inspector Baiko and all that. There's a great documentary on the Blu-ray called Lights, Camera, and Action. I highly recommend watching that documentary. I think it's the second to best documentary on the set, including, Enter the Clones of Bruce, because it really digs into Alphonse Beni's career, gives like a historical perspective of what was happening at the time, how he made these like movies. Camera Connection is also pretty unique with the cinematography because it shows Cameroon as is, I will put it, because it's shot guerrilla style. So they were showing up to locations without any filming permits. So you get to see not only the people of Cameroon, but also them looking directly into the camera lens. So not one of the best films on the set, and probably the least Bruceploitation film, but I enjoy very much more compared to the other films we talked about beforehand. This next film marks the first movie in the Bruceploitation subgenre to capitalize on the unfinished movie Game of Death, which was a movie that Bruce Li started filming without completing a script, mind you. Filmed about like an hour of usable footage, and then he went off to make Enter the Dragon. Then he was planning to go back to Hong Kong to finish Game of Death after Enter the Dragon completed. He died shortly before Enter the Dragon premiered, so the movie was left unfinished, but there were a lot of photos, a lot of publicity talking about Game of Death that Golden Harvest had released. But before Golden Harvest themselves could actually, finish the movie, the Bruceploitation filmmakers strike first, particularly Ho Jung-dao as Bruce Li in Goodbye Bruce Li, his last Game of Death. So in this movie, it starts with a 10-minute documentary about Bruce Lee's life and Game of Death, and then kind of does a turnaround towards the end of it, where it's like, we thankfully found another actor who could fit in place of Bruce Lee, and that actor being Ho Jung-dao, and he's taken to a movie theater to watch the incomplete footage of Game of Death, which features Ho Jung-dao also playing Bruce Lee in Game of Death. Yes, it is trying to convince you Ho Jung-dao is playing Bruce Lee, even though it's saying like, oh, look at this Bruce Lee footage, and it's like Ho Jung-dao himself. And somehow this trick actually works with some viewers in the US, so they actually thought they were actually watching the actual Game of Death, which is very surprising. I thought it was like pretty decent for the most part. I like the story, although it has some stuff that doesn't make entirely sense, and doesn't try to tie the terrible tower set or even like try to match it properly, light it properly to match with the actual tower for the exteriors. The fight scenes were actually pretty well done for the most part. I did enjoy them, but I feel like I like this movie a little bit more compared to other people and all that, because Goodbye Bruce Lee, along with Super Dragon and Cameron Connection, usually sit as the lowest rated films in the Bruceploitation genre, or at least in this box set. The film does feel surprisingly slow paced, even though it has a very short runtime, an hour and 20 minutes. I guess the only reason they didn't like try bother to make it even shorter, they realize, oh, we're now selling people a movie that has an hour 15 minutes or an hour 10 minutes and all that. A movie too short. One of those movies, saving grace, is having a pretty good theme song.
He's the king of kung fu. Don't worry.
But Goodbye Bruce Lee isn't that much of a terrible like Game of Death ripoff, but there are far better Game of Death ripoffs or far better Bruceploitation films on the sets, and we're slowly getting into them. Next one being Rage of the Dragon, aka Mission of the Dragon. We're now getting into the Dragon Lead films, which he's from South Korea, and this is entirely a South Korean production. It's credited to being directed by Godfrey Ho, which I think it's like a name and only credit. I'm forgetting who's the Korean director of the movie, but he probably like definitely shot the movie and not Godfrey Ho. Maybe Godfrey Ho was involved with the dubbing, but I don't think he directed the movie. To be honest, I rate this higher than like the previous films we talked about, but I feel like, over the months from not watching the film, it kind of like slowly forgettable, weirdly enough. The story is like pretty decent, and the dubbing is sometimes unintentionally funny and all that. But I think like the few memorable stuff in the movie is the fight scenes with Dragon Lee, of course, especially because you have Carter Wong in the movie, and there's this cool fight scene towards the end where it's told before that Carter Wong has bad eyesight, so he fights against that with his own makeshift armor. And I feel like Rage of the Dragon is like one of those movies that I feel very middle of the road of, but it's not like something I would like rewatch, again and again compared to their other movies and all that. But Rage of the Dragon is a pretty like middle of the road film for me. The next film is very much of a mess, but a really fun movie to watch. Enter Three Dragons, which the title of the movie and along with the poster artwork was supposed to be a different movie about Dragon Lee and Ron Van Cleef, who was also another Bruceploitation actor, particularly in the Black Dragon movies like Way of Black Dragon, The Black Dragon, The Black Dragon Return. It was supposed to be a prison escape movie that unfortunately got cancelled, and the poster artwork and the title was instead used for this confusing mess of a story, which apparently is about a guy named Sammy who needs help to fix up a loan shark problem. So he calls up his friend Dragon, which ends up being the wrong person named Dragon. Apparently it's the brother of Dragon, so it's a Dragon Yoon and Un. But there's also Dragon Lee in the film, which I think he goes under a different name, but I think he's also named Dragon, if I remember correctly. But the main gang behind the Loan Shark scheme is figuring out that Sammy is trying to fight back against them, so they capture one of the dragons. So the other dragon and Dragon Lee and also their friend have to go save that dragon's life and also save somebody else's life. And at the end of the movie, Dragon Lee kills off Philip Ko, who's in charge of all of this mess. So to be honest, when I first saw the movie, I did not find the story to be that confusing, besides the part where I confused between Bruce Li and Bruce Tai. Yes, the title was not wrong. There is in fact 3 Bruceploitation actors. I think it was Bruce Tai who's in the least amount of movies because he's in The Clones of Bruce Li and this film, and I don't think he's in anything else. Bruce Li, I think he did a few more movies compared to Bruce Tai, but the first 30 minutes, I thought both of them were playing the same character until one of them gets captured and I go, oh, they're 2 different characters? But why do they have the same haircuts, sunglasses, and fashion? Besides that, I did really like the fight scenes and the cinematography for the most part, especially towards the end of the movie where we have some interesting exterior shots of the forest where it's very foggy and Philip Ko is running across it and all that. But the story is very sporadic, which gives into the theory that they shot this movie without a completed script and possibly across several months. Usually with these movies they take less than a month or even less than 2 weeks to film. This film also has a weird sense of humor, which kind of clashes with the semi-serious tone of the movie because you have these comedic relief characters, but they feel very out of place and out of nowhere. And Dragon Lee, although I feel he might be the main selling point, his face is on the poster, but he has a very distant role in the movie. He was based in Korea, and I think this was mostly a Hong Kong / Korean production. In fact, this was Dragon Lee's first Hong Kong production, but it could have been co-produced with South Korea from what I know. And Dragon Lee does have an interesting comment about the production, which is that from what I could tell, they could have shot 3 movies. There's a movie called The Blazing Ninja, which is also credited to Godfrey Ho, but it's a cut and paste film, which is mixes between a movie talking about Chinese versus Japanese occupation and all that. I forgot if that movie takes place in World War II or it's just very anti-Japanese.
You're well trained. Thanks. Now I can serve my country.
But inserted sporadically in the movie is footage from Enter 3 Dragons, featuring one of the Bruce clones in the Game of Death getup, which I kind of find a little bit funny because the game that came out the year when Enter 3 Dragons came out in 1978. You also have a reused scene in The Blazing Ninja featuring Bolo Young, which he makes a cameo appearance for one scene in Enter 3 Dragons using the same footage and all that. Not only that, one of the later fight scenes with Dragon Lee for Enter 3 Dragons appears as the opening fight scene in Enter the Invincible Hero. Add on top to that, where apparently this movie was shot back to back with the Clones of Bruce Li because it uses some of the same key locations that Clones of Bruce Li appears in, such as this gym / dojo room, but also some of the same actors besides Dragon Lee. I feel this movie was shot in a several month process because Enter the Invincible Hero came out in 1977, Enter 3 Dragons came out in 1978, and Clones of Bruce Li came out in 1980. So that's about 3 or 4 years between those 3 movies and all that. But the thing is, the opening fight scene of Invincible Hero, it's extended for Enter 3 Dragons as if they shot that fight scene for Enter 3 Dragons. This is all confusing. Let's just move on to the next movie, another Bruceploitation biopic, The Dragon Lives, featuring Ho Jong-dao as Bruce Li. Apparently this is the only Bruceploitation biopic which starts from Bruce Lee's birth to his death. Well, you don't see that in the official Bruce Lee biography that was made in the 90s, so I guess this has something for going. But of course, it's very patriotic, as I mentioned before, about Bruce Lee being Chinese. So instead of Bruce Lee being born in San Francisco, he's born in Hong Kong during a lightning storm. It's very much of a Cliff Notes version of Bruce Lee's life, getting facts wrong or changing events around here and there. It does the trick where it tried to disguise, Taiwan as the US and all that, but I feel this was more of a successful attempt compared to Super Dragon. Although you do see some European actor selling hot dogs from a Chinese hot dog stand in front of what supposedly is San Jose University university. But the fight scenes and cinematography is much more better compared to Super Dragon, and the story is slightly more improved, and the dubbing isn't that terrible. So I like this more compared to Super Dragon, and also I like the performances as well. The ending does get weird and all that, and does, fade into Bruce Li having an affair with Betty Ting Pei, of course. But I think I would recommend watching The Dragon Lives, over Super Dragon if you're just getting into the box set and all that, because it's very much of a better movie. We're now getting close to the top 5 Bruceploitation films that I love on this set, but we're one more movie away from it. And it's probably like one of the most famous Bruceploitation films out of this entire set. This is probably the one you have heard about numerous times and mentioned, or maybe have watched. The Clones of Bruce Li, featuring Bruce Le, Bruce Lai, Bruce Tai, and Dragon Lee. Of course, the story is pretty basic. There's this evil scientist, and in part with the British government, he makes 3 Bruce Lee clones. Bruce Lee 1, 2, and 3. There's Chuck, who kind of looks like Bruce Lee, hence why there's a 4th Bruce in the title, because apparently that was his pen name. Besides that, for the first hour of the movie, it dedicates itself on 2 separate missions. I feel like this is the movie's losing point that I think would just have worked incredibly better if they were intercutted. But no, there's just 2 separate missions, like a TV show or something like that, that play one after another until the end, where the Bruces join forces together. Is like, hey, the true villain is actually the evil scientist. Let's go get him. So I feel like that's what's stopping the movie from being a little bit better, is because it just has like a slow story structure in the middle, but that there doesn't really pick up towards the end and all that. And there's those, absurd sequences. Like, for example, there's also another evil scientist who creates an army of bronze men, but also is trying to create like a fertilizer that kills all plant life. Godfrey Ho worked as an assistant director on this film. He also worked on Enter 3 Dragons. I feel like there's a good quote from him in the book, These Fists Break Bricks, which he refers to the ninja movies, but I feel like they apply here with the Bruceploitation films. I feel like Clones of Bruce Li, Enter 3 Dragons might fit that scenario. It's like, oh, we have these Bruceploitation actors. I don't know, maybe it takes a lot of time to write a script. Let's just start filming them, tell them to choreograph some fight scenes. But it is neat, seeing, the Bruce clones together in one movie together, fighting it out against like pretty well choreographed fight scenes. The slow parts include like the promo trip to Thailand, because they go to Thailand for one of their missions. That's where they meet the Chuck, and then they just have a tour around Thailand. Now think about, I feel like this movie might partly fall into being a comedy. Yeah, sure, it could be unintentionally funny. It is produced by Dick Randall, which he does have this sense of humor where he'll buy foreign films and have like funny, humorous English dubs towards them, even though probably in the original language versions they weren't actually that humorous or funny.
And then I will show them all. Am I not a genius?
Yes, Professor. You're something.
And apparently this was his idea to make the Clones of Bruce Li and all that, because there's some stuff in the movie that you can't really take seriously, such as the bronze men, the siren scene, of course, at the beach. I think the one thing that really like throw a dart at on my like theory of this being more of a comedy than like people take it as is the science. Because when you see the lab, it's very bare bones. There's nothing in the lab. There's just a bunch of color lights. John Ben is pressing random buttons, and Bruce Lee has this like bowl that you use for cooking over his head, attached with random stuff and all that. And it's also like with the other scientists, he has this lab in this like abandoned building, not even a basement, and there's like a hole in the wall that the Bruces go in to like, check on the potions. Can he afford like a better looking lab? Sure, you could keep it secret from like authorities, but at least like, make it look a little better when you enter it. I feel like that's not an example of low budget. I feel like it's more of an example of a haha, let's like make fun of this idea because how absurd it is. It's the Clones of Bruce Lee. What do you expect? I'm thinking about that might be like my breaking point in my mind, saying like, wait, is this more of a comedy, or maybe it's like making itself to be like, you're laughing at the movie? But that's just a theory I have and all. Maybe when I do like a more expansive review of the Clones of Bruce Lee, I bring in other people with me trying to like, analyze this movie on a deeper level and all that. It's like, is this more of a comedy? So yeah, Clones of Bruce Lee, very much of a highlight on the box set, and it's also like, the one movie you should also watch as well. Besides the top 5 Bruceploitation movies on the set, let's get into them. For the top 5 Bruceploitation movies, we have suddenly changed a different camera angle and a different shirt and removal of facial hair. Anyhow, my number 5 spot for the Bruceploitation ranking has to be one of the most probably like famous Bruceploitation films out there and all that. Also one of the most absurd films as well, Challenge of the Tiger, featuring an all-star cast. Richard Harrison, of course known for Ninja Terminator right here. Bruce Li, Dick Randall playing in a small role, who's also a producer of the film. Won Jong Lee, Bolo Young, and that one lady from Conan the Barbarian. And if you think that's awesome, get this. The story is about a group of scientists created a serum to inseminate every single male on the planet in order for them not to reproduce. But then this gang is trying to go after it, and they kill the scientists and take the serum, or the formula as they refer it across the film. And they're planning to use it to take over the world, because they're also Nazis as well. So the government, I'm not sure which government, they get Richard Harrison and Bruce Li to seize back the formula. Or Seize the Formula, as an alternate title of the movie displays it. This movie is also known as Gymkata Killer.
And a new kind of martial arts superhero is born. Gymkata.
I really enjoyed this movie. I enjoyed this movie very much, even though it has an insane, like, MacGuffin of a plot device that tags along the story. I really enjoyed the movie and also the fight scenes as well. In fact, I was rooting for the movie sometimes whenever Brad Harris appears, and I was like, oh, they gotta get Brad Harris and Bolo Young just, like, fight each other. And they do fight each other for, like, one scene. I was like, man, I wish there was a more extended fight scene, because it would have just been cooler to just see these really two buff guys just beating the hell out of each other. My biggest issue with the movie is Richard Harrison as a character, and also Harrison spending way too much time with the ladies. Like, his only, like, main skill is that, look, Bruce, here's our idea. I go meet up with our suspect and sleep with them. You go look for the formula as me and her are hanging out in the bathtub. It spends a little bit way too much time on it, because, like, I'm more interested as, like, oh, they gotta get this, like, you know, formula and all that before this evil Nazi organization somehow uses it whatever ways possible. If it was, like, a short edit of the movie where it just, like, reduces the amount of Richard and the ladies footage, I think it would put just, like, been, like, a very much of a faster paced film that would be much more enjoyable. Although, that will be an interesting edit. There'll probably be a debate on, like, how much of the footage do you want to keep of the famous tennis scene. What appears to be most of the locations that you see in the film are shot without permits, which is that uncommon with these, like, low budget productions. But it gets really funny because they go to an event, and it looks like it was some, like, movie event, and they bring in, like, their cameras and all the actors, and you see everybody's, like, wearing their tags, but they're still in costume. And the funny thing, they somehow sneak in a Jack Klugman and Jane Seymour cameo, put their names on the poster saying guest stars Jack Klugman and Jane Seymour, and each of them barely appear for less than 15 seconds, and the footage just Bruce Li going up to them, shaking their hands, and walking away, while the crowd sometimes like look into the camera as like, oh, there's a movie camera here, they're filming us. But I was like thinking, like, why not just like bring a zoom lens as long if you're just cinematographer or camera operator, and you notice that you're filming a crowd scene and people are looking into the camera, you just like zoom in on the person that you want to film, so you get less of those people like looking into the camera. It's like, oh, there's a movie right here, I wonder what it's all about. Also want to highlight the audio commentary film, which is done by Michael Worth and film historian C. Courtney Joyner, and they have a really fun time talking about this film, and you really do give a perspective what it was like at the time making a movie like this. And I also want to mention that this movie is very much of a transitional point of the Bruceploitation films, where the Bruceploitation actors are kind of finding their identity and more or less start making movies that are less inspired by Bruce Li besides themselves doing the Bruce Lee shtick. So you have Dragon Lee at the time, he's making more comedic martial arts movies, such as Golden Dragon, Silver Snake, and Dragon the Hero. And then you have Bruce Li, who it takes an interesting turn in his career where he's doing these like James Bond type of movies, such as Challenge of the Tiger right here, whereas of course very much of a James Bond story. And Hong Jung-Zhao, he's trying to get his best to distance himself behind that Bruce Li name, even though the producers were forcing it upon him. For example, in 1976, he made a movie called The Ming Patriots, but it was when it was released in the US, they changed his name back to Bruce Li. And I think this is because it all occurred after Game of Death, which is considered by many as like one of the worst Bruceploitation movies out there ever made. But speaking of Game of Death, the next movie in the ranking, number 4, is Enter the Game of Death. Now, this is a way better Game of Death ripoff compared to Goodbye Bruce Lee, because Enter the Game of Death is literally just simply trying to copy and paste the story of Game of Death. It's Bruce Lee playing this spy, trying to find documents to stop the Japanese from occupying China, but the documents are hidden up in this tower, so he has to fight through a bunch of guards, and then go through the tower and fight through interesting fighters. The story is just 80% fight scenes and 20% plot, and the fight scenes are pretty well choreographed and pretty creative with the different type of fighters that you see in the tower. You also get Bolo Young playing a Japanese villain, of course, which I wonder how often he does that, just playing Japanese villains from movie to movie. Although this movie is like pretty fun to watch, there is some issues with it. Some of the footage is out of focus or soft focus, so there isn't really like sharp details in some of the sequences. I wonder if they were just very much on a rush, like filming those like drama scenes, because I don't remember any of the fight scenes being out of focus for the most part, or maybe like a few shots here and there. So they're like kind of like slogging it along with these like drama scenes. It's like, okay, film this, film that. Alright, let's move on. We gotta film Bruce Lee fighting against the snake guy. Also, the movie also deals with a bit of animal cruelty, because there is a snake fighter, and it was actually a stuntman who was a specialty of wrangling snakes for film productions. I wonder if he ever worked for the Calamity of Snakes right here. But he does this thing in the movie where he rips a snake's head off and spits it on the ground and starts spewing the blood out against Bruce Lee, and Bruce Lee is trying to avoid it. And I'm just hoping, oh gee whiz, I hope that he didn't actually bite off the head of a snake. There's also some pretty interesting music cues of the film. Like, for example, I recognize some music tracks from King Kong, the 1976 film. But yeah, Enter the Game of Death is a pretty good Game of Death ripoff and Bruceploitation film. The third film in my top 5 list is another film that represents a transitional period where they're slowly, getting away from like the Bruceploitation inspired stories and more trying to make their own original stories. That being Bruce and the Iron Finger, also simply known as Iron Finger, featuring Ho Zhang-zhao as Bruce Lai and Bruce Long. I actually saw this movie right after Bruce Long passed away, because I was more familiar with Bruce Long's most famous film, The Dragon Lives Again. No, not Kung Fu Hustle. And before you ask, no, I have not seen Kung Fu Hustle yet. Which is funny because I have friends who aren't into martial arts movies, but they're so surprised at the fact that I have not seen Kung Fu Hustle, which they have seen themselves. The story is about a martial arts fighter who is a murderer on the loose. Thankfully, a detective named Bruce Li is there to try to solve the murder, but he needs help along the way. He gets Bruce Long to help him out to find the murderer. I thought it was above decent, and I really like the cinematography, and it actually seems pretty planned out with the fight scenes. This movie also features stolen music such as the Superfly theme, the Sweetback's Badass Song theme. No, it does not include the theme to Shaft unless it was just be a very groovy soundtrack. My biggest issue with the movies probably has to be like the way the dialogue is written, because sometimes it's just unintentionally funny.
What time was it when One Kai left here?
Did his wife ask you to come here? Or are you gay?
Most of the movies on the set, they don't include alternate audio tracks, so you can't entirely compare and contrast. Like, let's say the Mandarin or Cantonese version is like, okay, is there like a translation thing going around here? Because there are Mandarin tracks for The Dragon the Hero and Bruce and the Iron Trigger, because there is a Mandarin trailer on the Blu-ray bonus features. And there is an argument like some of these movies are just meant to be exported internationally in English-speaking markets or like European markets. So they didn't really have much of a domestic release in Hong Kong or Taiwan. Unfortunately, this movie comes from a 35mm theatrical print that they got from a private collector, and actually looks pretty good for the most part. It isn't beat up that much, but it looks like a pretty clean print. According to movie censorship, they compared this to like another like widescreen copy of the movie somewhere out there, and they brought up how there might be deleted scenes that nobody has yet to discover, which features nude women in a bathhouse that was featured in promotional stills. But yeah, Bruce and the Iron Finger is pretty good, but it is sort of like slowly straying its way some from Bruceploitation storyline, and now it's just like the stars themselves. We're getting closer to the number 1 movie out of the Bruceploitation box set, but for number 2, it's The Dragon the Hero, aka Dragon on Fire, featuring John Liu, Dragon Lee, Tina Wong, Philip Ko. It's an all-star cast and crew. I have talked about this movie before, such as a review for Dragon the Hero on my YouTube channel, and it was a part of the discussion of the first episode of the Bulldozed Cinema, where it played as a double feature for 2 weeks in 42nd Street with Cannibal Holocaust. This movie is pretty awesome. It has like my favorite fight scenes, my favorite final blows. It has really interesting concept. Like Philip Ko is practicing with black magic to increase these like fighting skills. There's of course Mad Dog, who's like a weird looking guy. There's some story issues here and there that I mentioned before, and some characteristics that I don't exactly like, and like some stuff that's not entirely explained. But this is like generally one of my favorite Bruceploitation movies out there, even though it is, like I said, for straying away from the genre. In fact, apparently Dragon Lee was added on last second right before they began filming, so when he had the pre-sales up, they could just advertise, "See the way of Bruce Lee in The Dragon the Hero," because Dragon Lee's now in the movie. I do kind of feel like Dragon Lee might be slightly distant from the film itself, kind of added on last minute, so they had to write him into a bunch of scenes. And it's also apparent in the editing of the last 13 minutes of the movie. In the original version of the movie, that is not in the Bruceploitation set. In fact, the Bruceploitation set features the US cut of the film. But in the original version of the movie, which is the Mandarin version and the English export version, both titled Dragon the Hero, it begins with John Liu beginning to fight Philip Ko, and then cuts to Tina Wong and Dragon Lee fighting Mad Dog. And Tina Wong leaves, but Mad Dog comes back to life. He fights off Dragon Lee kills him, and then the rest of the movie, it's just Tina Wong, John Liu fighting against Philip Ko. In the US version, they seem to try like extend Dragon Lee's appearance for the movie, but it's kind of edited in a sloppy fashion where they extend the final fight between Dragon Lee and Mad Dog to like intercut with the final fight between Tina Wong, Philip Ko, and John Liu. So I'm pretty upset that there isn't like an alternate cut version, or maybe at least a reconstruction of the alternate cut presented on the Blu-ray set, because unfortunately some of the extended scenes are featured in the international version, which are just deleted scenes of the comedic duo that occasionally appear in the movie. They couldn't find film elements for those sequences, but they do present the deleted scenes from like the international version on the Blu-ray as a bonus feature. But I think they come from this DVD master here. It's not a great DVD because I've talked about it before. It seems to come from a Mandarin 35mm theatrical print. There's burnt-in Chinese and English subtitles, and it's a Mandarin audio track, but it's like really terrible, where it's letterboxed for 4x3 TVs, so when you zoom in, the bitrate is just horrible. But yeah, as you could tell, I really like The Dragon the Hero. I highly recommend watching it for anybody, and one of my favorite bonus features on this set is a 30-minute interview with Godfrey Ho, where he talks about, you know, making the movie and how he got into like making movies and all of that. And there's actually a very informative audio commentary of Godfrey talking about making this movie. As much complaining I could do, I'm just very happy this exists and all that. You get all these movies in HD masters and all that. You don't see like other companies stepping in to like do this. For our final film, if you haven't noticed a movie that I have not talked about yet, if you're very aware of this Blu-ray set or you aren't aware of it, I think it's also famous as well, and it needs no introduction. The Dragon Lives Again. So it's Bruce Long playing Bruce Lee, and he gets transported into the Underworld. Not hell, as some people will say. The Underworld. And shortly after being there, he already makes a fight with the king of the Underworld, and with this gang that don't like him, featuring, okay, get this, Clint Eastwood, or in the US poster, Ringo, Zatoichi, the Blind Swordsman, The Godfather, James Bond, our army of skeletons, also known as zombies, controlled by Dracula.
Listen, Dracula, your zombies can't help you.
Mummies, Emmanuel for some reason.
Exorcist, will you remember me after you've become the king?
Oh, Emmanuel, you're so beautiful.
To be honest, this being very much of a 70s villain cast, I'm surprised they didn't try to throw in a shark at some point. Oh yeah, Laura Hardy's in the movie playing the two bumbling cops for the Underworld. But don't worry, Bruce is not alone. He has his own team of friends, which includes Sammo Yoon playing a doctor, Sammo Yoon known for the Drug and Master films. You also have David Carradine from the TV show Kung Fu, Popeye, and the One-Armed Swordsman. Yeah, you can see how insane this cast is. Even in the audio commentary of the movie with Frank Jang and Mike Worth, they're all generally surprised at how in the world this movie not end up in a lawsuit. I guess it falls under parody law, but it doesn't really excuse the fact that the amount of stolen music that they sold for this movie. But a great mystery as it is without an answer, this movie is just bonkers, and it's adamantly a comedy martial arts movie. But I generally like it the way it is because it's very self-aware of what it is, and also it's a comedy, so you're meant to like laugh at the movie. There isn't much of a like an overarching story. That's like one of the few issues used with the film. Well, Bruce's like main goal, he wants to go back to Earth, but I guess what's like preventing him is like the gang of like copyrighted characters preventing him from like, you know, going up to Earth or just causing his underworld life being miserable until Bruce, you know, fights against them all. The film also has gratuitous sexual scenes, especially with like the king of the underworld. Emmanuel tries to seduce Bruce. She seduces the king of the underworld and tries to kill him through sex.
That's it. Her pussy's in this plot too. She was using it to murder me.
Which I wonder what happened to that lady, that actress who plays Emmanuel. Because I think this is her only film credit. So I'm presuming she was like just some backpacker from like, I know, Europe and all that. That was just happened to be in the perfect time that they were looking for a white lady for this movie. On top of that, you also have like a hilarious English dub.
That Bruce Lee guy is really something.
But I feel like it's just unintentionally like funny because the dubbers are delivering like lines of dialogue which not a normal person would say.
That's really taunting. If we can't rely on James Bond, who's gonna get Bruce Lee?
The fight scenes are really well choreographed. There is some like oddball choreographed stuff and all that, especially with like the group fight scenes with the mummies or the skeletons. Especially with the mummy scenes where the mummies are kind of like just doing this in the background as like Bruce is like fighting in the foreground. But you do get some like comedic fight scenes where like the mummies are like doing like a twirl and they're hugging Bruce and all that, and then like they get him like dizzy like to fall down. The thing I want to mention is the preservation of this film and all that. Even though it's like one of the best Bruceploitation films out there and like one of my personal favorites along with The Dragon the Hero, unfortunately the preservation of this film is not that great. The original camera negative from Hong Kong has unfortunately deteriorated to be completely unusable for restoration. So Severin Films had to use a 35mm US theatrical print from the American Drama Film Archive that they had preserved themselves for film screenings. Because that's like another thing. This movie, you could have never seen this movie in HD or in widescreen at all for decades. There was only like 2 or 3 US VHS releases. Apparently one of them had a wider image, and that was posted by Harley Thomas, I think, on YouTube. But I don't think they actually ever transferred that tape at all. So the only good way to see this movie is if you catch one of these film screenings from AGFA whenever they presented it. Then Severin Films discovered a French print of the movie that featured these extended deleted sequences, which I'm presuming they were part of the original Hong Kong release. Because if you look at the US trailer of the movie, it features a few of these deleted sequences, at least a few excerpts of them. So it's like a presumption they might have come from like, you know, the original release, and you know, the US distributors just like, you know, cut them out to like make the movie much more fast paced. But unfortunately the French print they found, although in widescreen, it was significantly cropped, so it's determined to be unusable for the restoration. So the deleted scenes are presented in French audio as a bonus feature.
Le voilà. Je crois qu'on va s'entendre, tenez.
Most of them are like longer dialogue scenes with like some sense of humor. Like we get an introduction scene with the Laurel and Hardy characters. We get an explanation on why does the doctor have a flying skeleton, and it was actually a skeleton coming for a checkup. According to the Blu-ray bonus features, they did not use this French print for the restoration of the movie that you see on the Severin Films Blu-ray set, which, to be honest, I find that hard to believe. If you look at the footage of the French print, it's very saturated and have high levels of contrast where the blacks are like significantly like darker and all that. So it has like a distinct look that you could like easily recognize. And there's a few points in the Severin Films restoration where the footage suddenly has a cooler color tone. Another thing about the Severin Films restoration is that it appears to be a different restoration coming from the same source compared to the version that AGFA put out themselves. So the source material they were dealing with was a faded 35mm theatrical print. They were able to bring back the colors for it, and you could see that beautifully in the version that they presented in their trailer. Now, if you compare that to the Severin Films version, you could see the Severin Films version have a subtle red coloring tone, probably left over from like the faded film print. But I was wondering how come they couldn't just use the AGFA restoration if it looks like significantly much more better in terms of the colors. And also I noticed another thing, which is that the AGFA restoration expands more of the image, because if you look at the Severin Films release, you can see they slightly crop in when you're comparing both restorations. So I'm curious how come they didn't just stick with the AGFA restoration. If anybody knows, let me know in the comment section and all that, because I would like to make a a bigger video like digging into this even more. Besides all that, I'm just really happy we're able to see this on Blu-ray here in HD, in widescreen, so you can actually appreciate the more of the movie at this, because this movie is very much framed for the widescreen format compared to like the cropped 4:3 VHS releases. So yeah, The Dragon Lives Again. Highly recommend to watch it, and it's one of my favorite films from the Bruceploitation box set. So yeah, that's all I have to say about ranking these movies from this box set here. If you want to debate me more about certain films should have a higher ranking or certain films should be much more lower in the list and all that, let's debate in the comments section. I am very excited for Volume 2. I didn't realize until recently they've been, working on that project for about 2 years since this Blu-ray box set came out and all that. I was looking into like some interviews, and also the Bruceploitation Bible Instagram page has given like teasers of like what's to come next. Hopefully we get Bruce Lee versus Superman in the next set, because that'll be hilarious to include. Also, it seems like we're going to get more Bruce Lee movies as well. And also, it seems like Bruce Lee came by Severin Films to film some introductions and probably like more interview stuff and all that. So I'm just like really excited what's going to come for the next Blu-ray set and what new HD masters are going to like put together, because we did see a lot of HD footage of some of these Bruceploitation films that haven't gotten any Blu-ray release yet, or maybe they just ended up on streaming. But I'm hoping like they will like resolve some of the issues I had with the initial box set, where there wasn't like alternate audio tracks, which would have been like a big bonus, and also opening titles or alternate cuts as well. And also maybe like they could do highlights on the English dubbing of these films as well, because if they're not going to include alternate audio tracks and just the English dubs, they may as well like do bonus features on what's the significance of like these English dubs and their presentations of it. If they dig into all this, I think it would just be a really great like Volume 2 box set. So yeah, that's all the video. Have a nice day, and later on come back to our video store.